Hey y'all, thank you so much for coming today on a Friday afternoon at what usually is the beginning of a very busy end of the year season. Um, Today we're going to be talking about sustainable scaling. Um, as always, also, we'd like to keep you informed and update you on the Progressive Multiplier team because we occasionally have my colleagues will show up who are subject matter experts in a lot of different things, or just to be flies on walls. And well, we always like to have y'all know who's who. And if you ever have questions and you want to reach out to anybody, please feel free to reach out to folks directly. And if you don't know who you should be asking questions of, hit me up. I'm always happy um, to connect you to the right people. But I am Polly Stamatopoulos. I'm the Senior Director of Movement Group Engagement here at Progressive Multiplier, and I am so very happy to be here today for Fundraising Fridays. For those of you who may not be aware, Progressive Multiplier is a funding intermediary. We help organizations build a progressive movement of, by, and for everyday people. We do this by organizing and leveraging funding to create on-ramps for progressive organizations to start, strengthen, or scale individual giving and earned revenue programs. Through both online communities of practice and our grant making and support programs, we build the progressive sector's revenue generation knowledge and skills so that it can amplify the people-powered movement. Basically, we know that organizing people and organizing money is how we create change in a democracy, and we're all about helping organizations do both. We have 3 grant-making areas: achieving justice, realizing democracy, and restoring the environment. Our definitions in these areas are pretty broad-based, and just about everything can land you in one of those categories. Our LOI is always available on our website, so if you have a fundraising experiment that you would like to get investment of not only money, but also strategic assistance support on your project, please feel free to fill out an LOI. As the funding intermediary, it means that we've got to raise the money to be able to give it away. But if you've got a project, it's always a good idea to submit something so that you can be on our radar screen. So, as you all know, you've been brought here today through our partnership with Resilience Initiative to just sort of help us create community here. Please remember to introduce yourself in the chat, name, pronouns, organization, and your role in the organization. It's always really helpful for us to sort of bridge those divides that are caused by these little boxes on the interwebs when we're on these videos. And I've seen magic happen by people connecting and sharing knowledge in the chat. So let's keep paying it forward to each other. So just as a reminder of what's available in this is that we have, of course, the Fundraising Fridays, which we've broken down into 2 types of sessions this time around. One is more like fundamental fundraising stuff. So that's usually the first session of the month. The second session of the month is more like current trends and like deeper thinking on fundraising and nonprofit related stuff. And so this is the second one of the month. We talk about it as like 101 level and 201 level for those of you who've been in the college environments and know that lingo. We also have coaching available. We have a limited number of hours. We're in the process of determining how many hours left. So, but if you do want coaching time, reach out. There is a sign up form, and so we might be at the tail end of the number of hours. So if you do have a need and you want to talk, like definitely fill out a form. We might be able to help you out. And especially if you know, like you just want one session, that's useful for us to know too. As always, we're always going to recommend checking out the Fundraising Friday YouTube channel. You can't Google to find it. You have to You have to use the link, the YouTube link for it. So we created a little short bit.ly for it. So hopefully it's easier to remember. And of course, when we send out the deck, you can always copy and paste it. But all of our Fundraising Friday videos over the 3-year program that we've done this with Resilience Initiative are there. So you can even see our own evolution of how we've been talking about different fundraising areas. And we always try to build on what we've done in the past and not necessarily do the exact same workshop. So you might see things named similarly, but I feel pretty confident that you'll get different things out of each version of those workshops. But we're not here to talk about the past. We're here to talk about the future. So what we're going to talk about related to sustainable scaling is the why and the how of scaling, and then how do we measure success? And hopefully we can also have time at the end to have a good conversation about it. So why scale? So this is, we're going to define some terms here because there is a little bit of like, there's a slight difference in the way at least we define scaling versus growth. Like I think that we interchangeably use growth and scale, and we're trying to differentiate these two ways of thinking and operating. So we see scaling as an intentional process that is related to vision, mission, values, and impact. Like getting to, our mission statement is what we're doing now, and our vision statements about like what the thing that we're trying to change in the world. Scaling is about how do we get to that end result, but and growth is usually about like how do we deal with the volume of work now. So that's sort of like the subtlest way to create a distinction. I'll go a little bit deeper into that in a minute. But I'm curious to know, like in this time, I've definitely seen lots of different things happening across organizations. Of the folks here today, I'd like to hear, would you say your organization is scaling, consolidating, like, or doing like a steady state, or, worst case scenario, receding? Anybody willing to jump on and tell me a little bit about where your organization is in this sort of framework? Go ahead. Hey,
Somebody else speak.
Kay, if you were speaking, I couldn't hear you.
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought I was muted.
Oh.
Well, I can.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
So my name is Melanie. I work at an abortion fund. And so we have scaled up quite a bit in the last 2 years with all of the legal sort of challenges that have occurred. We've received a huge influx of funding. However, we're trying to balance the fact that we were a very small organization prior to all of this. So it's an issue of sort of managing that scaling up, but also we're very nervous about the idea of that funding sort of either sort of plateauing or even dropping off in the near future. So we're trying to be really cognizant of what our actual ability is at this moment to, try and keep up with the need.
So if you go to the Fundraising Friday YouTube channel, we did a session called Lightning in a Bottle, and it really talks a lot about surge fundraising and how to managing the surge. And then I think some of the discussion there might be helpful. But yeah, that's totally like sometimes stuff happens and it impacts what you're doing now and forces the discussion about scale. Go ahead, Marissa.
Yeah. Lightning in a bottle. There was a study done by a former NILKer, and we were among the organizations that because she was my colleague, that she investigated. And so it's interesting. I think the National Immigration Law Center is right now on the other end of that like scaling up trajectory. We also were beneficiaries of a huge influx of funding after President Trump was first elected, like on all kinds of levels, institutional, individual, just, and we were able to scale up tremendously. And right now, I mean, we're now in a moment where we're experiencing a lot of not huge amounts of decreases in funding, but a lot of more, there's a lot more introspection, I guess, on the funder side anyway, about like, oh, we might now fund in this way. We might find at the state and local level, we're a national organization. We might be going in funding reproductive health issues or democracy issues, things that are not directly connected to the work that we do. Like, it was so easy for people to say, like Trump was such a hater in terms of immigrants' rights. And so that's kind of like, I think we're right now as an organization in the staying put kind of, staying pat kind of situation, holding pattern, and just trying to make sure we can even just sustain the growth that we have been able to achieve over the last 5 or so years. And that's why I signed up for this.
Yeah, I do think that sometimes the discussion about scaling, and especially around sustainability, only like happens in these moments of either flash loss or flash gain. And sometimes gain is followed by loss, because we all know that like it feels like every 3 years funders decide that they want to do like a navel gazing period, and they're like, hey, we're going to take a time out from new funding this year, and so we'll just renew you this year, but we may or may not be back, and it's like, great, thanks for the heads up, but also the vagueness isn't that great. Yeah, so anybody else want to chime in on like where you are? I'd also love to hear like if you all have like a decision, if there's a decision making matrix model thing that happens, or does it just sort of happen, catch as catch can?
Sure, I'd like to chime in. Our organization, I'm the VP and Director of Development, although it's in a small organization that had one primary foundation funder that was consistent over a number of years. And the rest of our fundraising primarily focuses on individual donors. And in 2019, our program moved from basically being run from the trunk of the founder's car to trying to incorporate some social media, some we've got a great accountant now. Our board is growing, so we're growing, but we've just found out recently that we're losing our primary funder. So it almost feels like we take one step forward and 2 steps back, and so we feel a little stagnant, but we're kind of on the cusp of growth. And I see that our biggest challenge as far as sustainability is concerned, and I think that a lot of organizations feel this way, is that all of our funding, it just seems from so many foundations, are restricted, and since the funding is so restricted, it's really challenging for us because we have to run individual programs for each of the funds that we qualify for. So just a little bit about us and where we stand.
Yeah, that is so real. When we have we might have a growth trajectory or be really planful about where we want to get to, or financially and also programmatically, and then there's such a big tide shift in the funding landscape, especially if you're heavily reliant on philanthropy, that all of your scaling plans get shot to hell. And so this is all why we wanted to have this session, actually, because scaling, a lot of times scaling happens because the resources are there, and or we think that they're there, and it gives us that like feeling of calm while we're planning our growth. And then when the resources go away, then there's panic, right? But if we can plan sustainably, thinking about those, um, thinking about how do we deal with surges, and also how do we deal with those financial cliffs that happen, if we can do this and with with sustainability in mind, um, we can still scale while dealing with the emotional and financial roller coaster that is our sector. So let's get into it then. So there are multiple peaks and valleys as we're in that roller coaster, but the benefits of those peaks are the benefits of like looking at it as like peaks and valleys means that um you can really focus on the things that matter most, right? Like, so, meaning, it was so like ethereal, but if you know the terrain ahead of you has like a pretty steady rhythm of like, it's going to have ups and downs, then that's like one way that you can just sort of level set, right? I am aware it's going to be peaks and valleys. Now the peaks and valleys don't bother me as much because I can expect them. So how do I think about growth knowing that it's going to be like this, sort of like those stock market charts where you show like the the growth, but it's in this like really jagged pattern, right? So thinking about scale and thinking about your growth trajectory towards your vision, really helps you align, like think about your vision, your impact that you want to have. It helps you identify, think about and identify ways to create efficiencies, um, in time, effort, but like things like cutting costs or changing processes so that, like we take less time to do something, now we have more time to do something else. Um, it also makes, if you're trying to get to your end goal, if you always have your end goal in mind, it helps you sort of think about like, how is our brand being seen? Are we doing enough reach? Like, can we change? For example, we want to change some major piece of legislation, or we want to move, environmental justice, tons of legislation around environmental justice. Can we do that within the scope of our community of people that we have connected to, or do we need lots more bodies in our database and our reach? So it helps you, if you keep your focus on the horizon and then think about like, what are the steps that I can do now to get to that horizon? It really does help you be, I think of it as like, being stepwise and methodical, in your processes, but it also changes a little bit the way that you speak about things. You're not just talking about the issues that we have today, but you're also doing a bit of a future view. It's sort of the way that I think of it is like, um, we want to have this impact, and we want to change this thing or do this thing or get to this point, and we're the ones who can help make that happen, because see, this past thing that we've done, this impact that we've had, this demonstrates that we can do this thing. So you can do both, use storytelling to tell your future plan and use your past experiences and successes to carry that sort of story along and to bring people with you to demonstrate your value proposition. And if you're not thinking in those terms of like, where do we want to get to and how do I use what we've done to get there, it's even difficult to think about how do we scale. You get stuck in the now, right? You get stuck in the like, we've got this many people. I've worked in lots of legal services organizations, right? We've got this many civil rights cases that we're fighting for. We just need more attorneys to fight those cases. Like, that's one way to do that. Or we can have a broader view and be like, how do we ameliorate the barrier that's creating the need for these cases in the first place? And what do we need to do organizationally so that we can attack that eventual barrier? Now, we're not going to just implement that program now. We've got to get to it. That has to happen programmatically and in your fundraising world. So again, so that was all like just basically to come back to the definitional distinction that I'm going to try to make. Though I have to say, like the interchangeability of growth and scale, even though I'm trying to create a distinction, I'm going to screw it up. But this is what I'm trying to get across. Is like really growth is about like dealing with a financial thing right now, dealing with the thing in front of us. Um, Growing because I just need more hands, versus like scaling is really about getting to the solution and what is the appropriate next step. Um, that jagged chart in a growth scenario is really just going to be like a straight line dragged chart, whereas like in a scaling scenario, it's a very much, bigger. It goes up, hopefully. Um, so again, growth is resources, scale is about impact, growth centers size, scaling centers reach. And then it's really about like how do we um we sometimes like just get lost in this like size of an organization. Oh, what size is your budget? Oh, you must be doing really great work because you have a lot of money. Well, we know all of our really cool, scrappy organizations are doing amazing work without a lot of money. We have to do it really efficiently, right? And nimbly and creatively. So if we get away from that growth language where size matters and get to the impact language and the scaling language, it really does help change the framework. And sometimes we put ourselves in a box because we feel like we're too new, we're too small, we're too compared to some other group that's taking up a lot of space in our ecosystem, when we actually have a lot to bring to the table if we can flip the way that we talk about what does it mean to be a top organization in our ecosystem. It's not about size, it's about impact, getting to the getting to that point of change that we want to get to. So for the folks who've actually talked about a little bit, and anybody else who wants to jump in, with that thought in mind, looking backwards, have you been on a growth trajectory or have you been on a scale trajectory?
I was trying to find the chat so I wouldn't didn't take over the room, but I think we've been both on National Immigration Law Center. We've been doing both.
It makes sense. There is a lot of ways it goes hand in hand. Yeah, Melanie, growth. Yeah. Search sort of creates that reality. Like if you get a bunch of money dumped on you because of a rage giving, sometimes you're just so busy processing and dealing with that surge of money that you actually don't have capacity to do, from the development staff at the very least, and probably finance, don't have the capacity to think strategically about how like asking the ED to use any of these fundings to help scale development. You're just thinking about growth. Like I need more bodies to process these things and to keep our stewardship up or whatever the thing is. Robert, you came on camera, so I'm assuming you got something to say.
Yeah, I was just going to say we definitely been on the scaling route. We intentionally went from being a Northern California based organization to a national organization, and have been very strategic about starting programming in different parts of the country. And it's been successful in that, we were then able to approach funders for $7 million gifts because funders that may have said, oh, you're too small for us or you're too regional. And then it sort of becomes like this upward cycle, because then you have a certain degree of scale and then people read your blogs more and then that leads to more. So it can be a virtuous cycle. I think what I'm thinking about, and part of the reason I joined the call, I don't know if we're getting to this later, is that by the very nature of scaling up, the way sorry, my dog is having a dream or something, I don't know. By the very nature of getting so big, can you continue to operate in the same way you did when you were smaller, which is part of what you build your success on. So I think that's the issue we're struggling with.
Yeah, I definitely will be touching on that because I think that there is a lopsided way in which a lot of organizations deal with, especially surges of money, and not even just surges, like an effective fundraising program that brings in decent revenue. Um, you'll see it, not to jump too far ahead, but like you'll see happen all the time where you get more revenue, it immediately gets pumped directly into program. Well, as soon as it gets pumped directly into program, the development office's plate is now fuller. The expectation, the bar has been raised. And it is sometimes hard to be like, hey, can break off a piece of that? We need to have a discussion we hear about that. Yeah, and I think it's a blind spot for for leadership sometimes because they just might think like, oh, okay, well, instead of getting a whole bunch of $25,000 grants, we just go get a bunch of $50,000 grants, as if yeah, that's it, that's all it is. And we all know that that is not how it is. So, all right. So then it sort of lines us up here because scaling is really about being really purposeful about your growth, right? It's about um, thinking strategically about the road ahead and not just plugging the holes in the dam. Um, like, as I've already mentioned, adding more people just because you have more money to add people is not scaling. This is where we start to interchange, like colloquially, you'll hear lots of people refer to that as scaling. Oh, we're scaling because we've got more people. No, you're growing because you have more people. If you're scaling, I'd like to hear about that. What's the end result that we're trying to get to? And how is the growth that you had in staffing going to scale you programmatically and intentionally? The other part of of this like conflation between growing and scaling is that, especially if you're an organization that's heavily reliant on philanthropic revenue that typically has strings, maybe it's government revenue too. So grants, all those funders that have like strings that say you can't fund these parts of your organization with this money. Like been in this business 3+ decades. It's usually development that can't gets cut out of that equation, right? Who do you think wrote the grant? Who do you think got this funding? So we can't pay for my time. How are we going to get it again? So they leave out the part of these necessary parts of the organization. Government funding does that a lot too. Now, government funding actually woke up before the philanthropic side did, like more than a decade ago, and said, oh, okay, we'll let you pay for grant writing with our government dollars. Like, let's try to, like the fact that government grants beat philanthropy on that is comical to me. But the thing that fund, like being heavily reliant on this funding and the strings that come with it, is sometimes hampers our ability to grow in the directions that we need to grow, right? Civic engagement, for example, a lot of our organizations that we work with have all this work that they do that is in the absolutely forbidden side of the list of things that you can do with grant money. So if you really wanted to create systemic change, grant dollars might not be the way that you need to do that. So to scale in that direction means you have to scale your independent revenue or your unrestricted revenue. The other thing about the restrictions, so that's the restriction part. The other thing that is touchier and is really much more like it sneaks up on you is the mission creep that comes from sometimes this funding. Sometimes we do it ourselves, like, oh, here's this grant that is like 75% perfect for us, but 25% not so much. But we're going to go for it anyway because 75% is good enough. And then you get it. Now you have this portion of your funding is like outside of your mission. And so you start to do these things that are sort of outside of your mission and your vision. and then you do that a little more and you do a little more, and now all of a sudden you've got this whole big all these piles of money that have caused you to diffuse your ability to keep your mission at the center, because you've got, great, that work is funded, but those people and that activity that's being funded with those strings are subtracting from your ability to do what is actually in your mission. So it might feel additive because, okay, great, from like a comfort zone, yes, my people are paid for that, I don't have to have any difficult conversations, but it caused a little bit of stray from mission, and that little bit can grow. So sustainable scaling really it is about being purposeful. It should cause you to think about more strategically, what does it mean to take this money that might draw us partially out of our mission and vision and might take us in a different direction than the trajectory we want to go in. Now let's talk about the how. So we think of this as like, building blocks, literally. So the essential foundational point of this is going to be a mission and culture discussion. If you are lucky enough to have a strategic plan, and I would say especially lucky enough to have a strategic plan that is relevant and actively used and not something pretty that sits on a shelf and it doesn't have any like day-to-day meaning in your organization. If you have a solid mission, vision, and a strategic plan, then you've already got the roadmap to help you scale. If you know, like a strategic plan usually is like, let's say 3, 5, 10-year plan. If you know where you want to be in 10 years, you've got now it's something that can help you chart your path, hopefully, if it's done well. So how do we get to this sort of alignment strategically? Let's say you don't have a plan, or even if you do, really need to look at your programming and your fundraising programs and how do they line up with the mission. So the easiest example here is like, if you're trying to change legislation and you need to put, let members of your either state or let's say federal government know that the people are with you and they should be thinking about these issues, then you need to be able to be like, we've got X thousands of people who agree with us and who are in your community, and therefore you need to listen to their voices. Fundraising has a role in that because fundraising is organizing. So if we are only a grants driven organization that has a advocacy arm, then our fundraising is not in alignment with our mission. Our fundraising should be actively seeking individual participation so that we can start to claim that we have the backing of people, not only in word, but in deed. So that's what I mean about like aligning your mission and your fundraising and making sure that they bolster and each other, and that they're pointing in the same direction. It is, like it is not, if you're really trying to create like really significant change, relying heavily on funders that have tons of strings attached to their money is, to me, oftentimes antithetical to getting to that end goal. Maybe you're lucky enough to have funders that don't have the strings, or the strings don't matter because they align perfectly. If you do, awesome. But my experience has been that typically I can't do what I need to do from a vision perspective with just philanthropic dollars. There's also a cultural issue. So think about that example that I gave about an organization that needs to do a big advocacy push. There are sometimes internal conflicts about like list use. These are my people. These are the people that we serve. We can't ask them for money. We're already asking our volunteers to do too much. They can't. You're going to kill my ability to get volunteers if you solicit them, because they're going to run away if you ask them for money. So there's often that tension internally. There's sometimes also just like that mental block about like the fundraisers are the gross capitalist and all they care about is money, and we're doing the people's work. And, there's just sort of this weird way of thinking. Fundraisers are part of the nonprofit industrial complex. We are doing the real work of the organization as if it can't exist in the same organization. If you've got that mindset happening, and I've just seen it so much, if you've got that mindset happening in your organization, that's an impediment to scale. 100%. You can't say that one side of or you can't have people who think that one side of your organization is good and one side is useless or bad and grow, like, and scale, I should say. Because one is an anchor, one has wings and one is an anchor, and it's going to be hard to fly, right? So auditing all of that, and not just programming, that the people, what is the culture, what do we need to change about the culture, is a really big first step. But also, like, part of culture is to make people feel bought into this conversation. And I know that sometimes we aren't the ones with the power to do this, but this is also part of our jobs, is usually to socialize new ways of thinking up the chain of command in our organizations. But like in doing things like surveying and focus grouping within your own organization to have people's buy-in to help change this way of thinking is also a foundational way to get to begin the process of having this like really intentional scaling conversation and activity. The other thing that really needs to be, like investigated, interrogated, is your systems. Not just like tech, but like systems. In the scenario about like in the advocacy scenario, is the advocacy work that you're doing, or the organizing work you're doing, or the outreach, the community education, whatever, are you measuring? Are you data collecting? Are we able to tell a story of impact? So in the programmatic areas, so that the fundraisers can use those impact points to tell stories, to engage funders and donors to give, to help us get to scale. Are the systems that we have in place, like our donation pages, able to handle the surge that happened after Roe fell? I know lots of organizations whose websites crashed because they just did not expect this to happen. Like they had the technology that they needed right now, and maybe not even good enough, but it was like duct tape and and spit and all the things holding it together, and it worked right now. But you can't keep building your organization with that type of system, right? So you need to plan now for the organization you want to be. You need to build those systems now, and it just might be that some of the system stuff is going to be processes, like things that have never been written down need to be written down, so that as you get to scale, you're not being held back because you don't have any of this stuff mapped. All the system things have to be in place for you to even you can't even imagine where growth would be if there's no ground under your feet. I mean, of course you can plan ahead, you can think big, but you can't put those plans into action if your systems can't hold it up. The biggest part that I have been alluding to tons of times already is that really diversification. Like the best way to scale your organization is to have resources at your disposal that are unencumbered, that you can do with it what your organization needs to do. Maybe it's save, maybe it's invest in new technology, maybe it's invest in a new fundraising strategy that doesn't bear fruit for 3 years. And that, and you are planful about it. But typically, like, if we really want to get to, let's say systemic change, and we know that our funders aren't going to let us do systemic change with their money, we need other money to do that systemic change. So if that's part of our 5-year plan, we can't wait to the time that program is supposed to launch to start fundraising for it, which means we need to invest today into something we're going to start 3 years from now. And that is sometimes difficult for folks to understand, even up the management chain. You find, finance people are sometimes focused on the now, but if if your organization does 3 or 5-year funding finance projection, those are conversations you're probably already having. But not a lot of organizations do multi-year budgeting. Multi-year budgeting is also a really important part of scaling, because then you can really see, like, okay, we need this year of building, you have a 5-year plan. This year is cleanup. Next year is we're going to start to build. The year after that is, creating the systems. The year after that is launch this new area of programmatic work. In what phase of this scale do we have to do infusions into the development department, so that by the time we get to that launch, we have enough revenue coming in to pay for that launch to happen? So that's part of, I think, the conversation about scaling when it happens, and like at the board level or with the executive director or management level. If you're not in those conversations, they don't know that piece. Or they're not thinking of that piece. And that's why you need to to be thinking of the piece. So sometimes you'll be the contrarian in the room, but better to have people thinking of those things now than not be able to launch because, oh no, we're actually not ready. And as dollar saved is a dollar raised, in my opinion. So the other thing that thinking about scaling does is it really does force you to look at all of your systems. If you've got a clumsy way of onboarding new staff that like takes up a bunch of the, like, let's say it's like your ops person or your finance person's job, who wears all these multiple hats to do the onboarding, and all these different people have to help bring on that new staff member, and it's always squeezing people on calendars that are already packed. The onboarding process then becomes super long, and that person isn't really up to speed right as quickly as you want them to be. I see that happen all the time. But there's probably tons of other ways that you don't have efficiencies, like in our own development departments. How are we using automation, and are there ways that we can build in automation so that we are running more seamlessly, so we're not spending hours doing something that could be done in seconds by the by the machines? Maybe do we need to look at processes and procedures that we have in place and think about, like, is this really the most efficient way to get from A to Z on this project? And get other people in the room in that conversation, because somebody's going to see something you're not seeing and be like, oh, you know what? We can skip these 3 steps by doing this one thing instead. And now you've made it something that takes you 2 hours to do into something that takes you 45 minutes. And I don't know about you, but if you give me an extra hour plus of my day back, I'm going to love you forever. When you do, like, especially when you're doing savings, that means, like, creating efficiencies that then should equal also monetary savings. That means it's just going to be cash left on the table. The other times that cash is left on the table, in quotation marks, is, let's say you've surpassed your fundraising goals and you brought in more money than was budgeted, right? Yay, rock star, gold stars all around. What happens? What happens with that cash that was more than you needed? Is there a system in place? Is there, a lot of times this will happen at the board level, like excess revenue goes into a fund, or excess revenue gets left on the table, or excess revenue is used at the discretion of the executive director. Maybe there's no fiscal rule at all. in place. Sometimes there are rules of like, if you're going to make an expenditure over $5,000 that is outside of the approved budget for the fiscal year, then that requires board approval. Like, what are the triggers that are going to need to be known, that'll be useful to know about to help you do some planning? Most organizations that I've worked with have zero plan about what happens when you have excess cash. And especially if it's like small, in quotation marks, whatever small means to your organization, that it just becomes like oh, cool, we can buy that thing we needed, or, this program manager is the squeaky wheel and keeps saying that they need more people. So I'm going to give it to the squeaky wheel rather than really think about this strategically. So I'm curious about how your organizations deal with those times where you have surpluses. Melanie, like this, how did y'all behave with the surge money? Was it like lottery winnings, and but in a bad way where everyone went crazy and bought Mercedes, or was it like lottery winnings of like, oh, this is never going to happen again, so we're going to hoard this and hold on to it, or something in between?
It was so I want to be careful because I don't have discretion to spend the money on certain things. That's not my position, so I want to be careful about that. But yeah, I think that it was helpful with the actual programmatic work to have that much money coming in, because all of a sudden the need was just so high and it was kind of nonstop at that moment. We definitely did grow by bringing on a lot of people, and it was exactly like you talked about, very messy. The onboarding process was awful because it was sort of just like, we need your hands on this right now. But I do think also we put some money away. But I do think there was probably a little bit of lottery type spending as well. We grew like our office spaces and that sort of thing. So yeah.
And stuff like that has legacy costs.
Yeah,
right?
definitely.
So then you've created a requirement for development to grow or scale, depending on your perspective. And you probably weren't roped into that conversation to make sure
No,
that
definitely not.
you can sustain those legacy costs.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's so typical. Sorry.
Thank you.
Does anybody know if you guys have like a process or a plan when you've got more money left, or even if ahead of time, like you see it happening a quarter ahead of time that you're going to have, you're going to beat your budget? Does anybody have a process or a plan in place in your organization? One of the things that I've done, sometimes successfully, but not always, is I will negotiate with my executive director in the beginning when I'm proposing my budget, my revenue projections as a fundraiser. And I'll say, this is what I think that we can raise. Now, this is if your organization figures out what you can raise before you figure out how you're going to spend it, or if it's done in tandem. I say, this is, when I go to my executive director and I say, this is what I think we can raise. This is I feel 100% confident number. This is my X% confidence number. And this is it's going to take a whole hell of a lot of work and it's not guaranteed number. I usually try to present things in that way. And then after there's a decision made about like which budget they're going to start adding expenses to. I'll usually try to say something like, if I beat my budget, I want a portion of that windfall to be reinvested in development. And I want to subtract that from our unrestricted dollars, because I know that's the only place that it can come from, usually or typically. So like if let's say I beat my budget by 25 grand, then I'll say, I'll ask for half. I know I'm not gonna get half, but it's my negotiation point. So if I get it down to even 10%, great. Then I've got an extra $2,500 that I can then have a strategy, have a tactic or strategy in place for that moment that I know that I'm going to beat that budget, where I say, okay, I want to invest this $2,500 or whatever percentage it is, my 10% growth in this way. So I want to buy ads. I want to do list growth. I want to do data hygiene. Maybe I hire somebody to come in and help clean up my database. Like like data hygiene is something that we don't think a lot about, but hiring someone to come in, even as a temp, to just help clean up the database creates efficiencies. If you don't have to like try to, pull 10 lists to get the data that you need, you've just saved yourself time. So I plan ahead of like, what are my investment points that I want to make? And I try to negotiate that in advance. And when I know that I'm going to beat my budget, I walk in and virtually, if not physically, walk in my boss's office and I say, I'm going to beat my budget this year. And it looks like I'm going to beat it in this way. And I want to start using my 10% to invest in this, this, and this. That is a strategic way to scale. You're making sure that you get a piece, that development gets a piece of the growth that happens, that resource in the moment growth of revenue that happens. You're now turning that growth model into a scale model. That's a hard conversation. And I know that not a lot of people are going to feel comfortable doing that. I probably did it the first time because I was too dumb to know I should be scared to do that. and young. And then, I got lucky and then I just kept trying to do it. And if I thought about that later in my career, I probably would have been too chicken to even ask. So yay for youthful exuberance. After you sort of like are looking at all that early like bottom row of bricks, then really like how do you then, after seeing what needs to be changed, where efficiencies can be created, where the holes in our processes are that we need investment in, where are the decisions being made? Are you at the table or are you not at the table? If you're not at the table, how do you get there? Or how do you socialize your thinking with the people who have a seat at the table so that they can start bringing those concepts into play? It is a really big mistake, but I see it happening quite a bit where these conversations about trajectory of growth of mission is a programmatic conversation. And it really needs to not be. And sometimes that is a big, where that goes right back to the cultural issue. That is a big cultural shift that needs to happen. So part of it is going to be like asking those questions of like, what are the triggers of like how we spend money that's out of budget? Like, I know we've budgeted and the board passed this budget of this thing, but what happens if we raise more money and we've got more, money left over? What happens to that money? Is there a rule? Who decides? Like, just get curious and start asking questions if it's not something that's evident. So figuring that out will also prepare you for the traps that you might fall into. Marissa, I'd love you to talk about the operating reserve.
Yeah, sure. At a time when we had that windfall of funding, the board did. I'm grateful. We have a good board, and they're very, cautious and engaged in lots of different ways. But they did look at that, and they were like, they thought ahead enough because they're very careful and cautious. I think they looked ahead and they were like, we should have some kind of operating reserve. And I think at even one point we did have an emergency fund. We were so flush with new funding, and there was no way we could grow that rapidly anyway, operationally. So they did create an operating reserve and a policy. I think there was an old policy to have like a certain, like we were so small and scrappy at the beginning that was like, 3 months of operating costs in a certain fund or something like that. And so they were, I don't even know, because I don't go to a lot of board meetings at this point, but I think it's up to 8 or 9 months now. And they really, really look at the budget every year and make sure that we're as close to as possible to maintaining that level of funding. And that is just like for rainy day, just in the event that we ever run into any problems. And, cross fingers we haven't yet, but, and at this point, I think this is the year when they drew a little bit from the reserve to cover what was going to be a gap. So
yeah, the thing that I have seen, I consulted for years. I can't tell you how many times I had to walk into board meetings and be like, it is amazing that you all set aside a rainy day fund. Like this is, advanced, this, good for you. You're being fiduciary responsible. It has been raining. Why did you not pull the trigger to pull from the rainy day fund? What do we need to do from a policy perspective, rules of the road? Board's job is oversight. Executive director is management. Give the executive director the info that they need to be able to know when to pull the trigger and use those funds. And it might require a board vote every time or something. There could, it doesn't have to be void of board decision, but there needs to be something so that to allow you to use it so that you don't get into this hoarding mentality, which I've just seen happen time and time again. So great that you have a rainy day fund, but define raining. And if nobody's asked the question, that's then be the person who starts asking the question. I have been in too many meetings where the executive director is like beating their head on their desk and just like, we've got this pile of cash in the bank and I just need to get through the next 6 months of this difficult period, and we know something's going to happen on the other side of it, but I just am not allowed to touch it. That's part of scaling. Having those resources as your safety net, your rainy day fund, however you want to think about it, is incredibly important. But you can't scale if you're never allowed to use those funds. You may never need to, but having the things in place that give you the permission to is part of how do you get there. Because scaling, like I said before, there's going to be creativity involved and some risk taking. And risk taking usually means that you could lose money in the process. And that's called raining in my book. So some of the questions that I think about when I'm trying to map out my scaling trajectory is I think about the surplus funding question, and like is it determined by a dollar amount or something else? Like what does surplus mean? Again, are there protocols or processes or rules hidden somewhere or public and you just didn't know of how that money gets used? Who makes the decision? So sometimes what I'll see is like a program didn't fill a staff position during the year, so their budget, they have money left over at the end of the year, their budget, and that program manager might be like, oh, I can spend this extra money any way I want to. Is that really the case? Or is that not the case? If you do extra fundraising for if you land a really big grant for a program that was unexpected and it was larger than the program's needs were, what happens there? Do they grow immediately? Do you retract some of the unrestricted revenue that goes into that pocket of money and replace it with that grant dollars? Like there really does need to be like a thoughtful mechanism in place to answer these questions, because you might not need that rubric now, but if you're really scaling, you're going to need that rubric at some point. And knowing who those decision makers are, rather than doing it catch as catch can, like, oh, Polly, you didn't hire that major gift officer, so you've got this big pile of money left over. I'm going to use it for program. or do I get to say, you didn't hire your legal director, so I'm going to take that money and use it for fundraising? Is there a system in place and what happens? And also, is that a performance measure? If your program managers are not scaling the way that you're intentionally scaling, does that become a performance measure you need to think about? So again, that goes back to like systems. Everybody, like where are the decision makers, and where are and when there's decisions to be made, there's also needs to be a system of accountability. So just, like some of the questions, and the last one is sort of my important one, especially if I'm not the one at the table. If I'm not invited to those conversations, who do I have access to that has influence, who's either in the room or who has more influence than I do in the decision-making process? And how do I make sure this thinking is incorporated in that? So not just mapping out where the decision makers are, but where are those levers that I can press? And I'm really focusing it on us, this group of people in this room right now, and development people in general, because this is, it's Fundraising Friday, and that's who I'm talking to. But also, like, as fundraisers, we often have to be the big thinkers in the room with the executive director and the board. Because we have to know how administrative side and the program side need to work together. We need to understand the trajectory of our organization so that we can pitch that as part of the storytelling to funders and donors and potential donors and whoever in the world that we're going after. And sometimes it is forgotten that we have that dynamic way of thinking. So we have to sort of keep reminding folks. So that let's say we do all this stuff and we use this to create like a vision of what our future then looks like. How do we know that we did it right? What is success? I think that one of the things that we do that is a detriment is like, if we haven't cured cancer, if we haven't gotten to like the big vision, the fully end result, then we're not successful, right? We haven't done the thing. There are lots of points along the path that we should be celebrating, and noting that we are hitting those benchmarks. We're hitting those that growth trajectory on plan. Like if you're going to be planning for growth over a period of time, that means you've got to create those incremental markers of growth. So that necessitates either going back to the planning documents or creating new or supplemental planning documents that talk about so strategic plans are, they're like high level, right? This is more like an implementation plan of the strategic plan, like a multi-year. So is there a support documentation that takes us from like this theory and puts it into practice? And what are the benchmarks along the way that we know that we're hitting on all cylinders? And typically it's not just one line, it's multiple lines, because you've got all the different programs, you've got development, you've got back of house, like accounting and systems and HR and all of that. Are we all growing at this scaling at the same rate? If we're not scaling at the same rate, what do we need to do? What adjustments do we need to do? Because we can't, it's really difficult to effectively scale if part of your system isn't. Like I said before, if you only invest in program and not in development, you're burning development, and that's not going to last. That growth is going to turn into a cliff that you're going to fall off of, because eventually you're going to tap out at the capacity of money that can be raised by the people and the systems that you have in place. That'll happen in every other area of your organization too. So all has to move in the same direction, pretty much in the same trajectory. I would say that the asterisk there is like scaling systems and fundraising a little bit ahead of the curve probably is an okay one to be ahead of the curve, but because systems create efficiency, and fundraising brings in the capital that you need to catch up, and programming can always catch up. But the other way around is just pretty much practically impossible, in my view. This is really where metrics come in, especially in our world and in fundraising. But having metrics in place so that we can see our growth trajectory in simple terms. What is our list growth? Are we hitting our list growth needs? What's our churn rate? Do we have too much attrition, and do we need to focus on retention? Like looking at all of the things, using data and not gut will help us do this better. If and programs need to think in this way too. Like, how do we make sure that our programs have a system that is measurable, that we can actually track, that we're, going up the hill, that there is growth happening in those areas, programmatically. So last year we did a session on metrics. There's also information in the fundraising planning on how to think about metrics, maturity modeling, stuff like that for fundraising. So I encourage you, oh, that is the wrong link. My bad. The Fundraising Friday one. There is a session in Fundraising Friday for that project, for that session, and you should definitely take a look at it. So analysis, as metrics are important, and therefore analysis is part of strategy. If you've never done SWOT, it's a really great exercise. And of course, it's great in a strategic planning scenario where you're doing this organizationally with an external scan and an internal scan, meaning outside stakeholders help you look at what your strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats are. And your board and your staff also talk about these things. That's a really great process. You don't have to wait for that to happen organizationally. You can do this on your own. You can do a back of the envelope, and I did this all the time, poly SWOT analysis of what I know about our programs, back of the envelope. But I'll also do this on my development program. I'll do like a look at my whole program, and then I'll even look in this way at all of my areas. What is my strength, weakness, opportunity, and threat as related to my individual donor category of donors? Am I diversified? Do I have a lot of small donors, a medium-sized number of medium donors, a small dedicated group of large donors? Is there a good mix there to keep my individual donor program strong? If not, what's missing? What do I need to fix? How do I fix that? And I'll look at all the categories, either all the categories of donors, or I'll do it by method. Is my direct response marketing program solid? And how are the different ways that I'm doing direct response? Am I mailing, emailing, SMS? What are the different ways where I'm doing a call and response, and how effective are they, and what's missing, what's broken, what's not working, what needs to scale back, what needs to be invested in? So I'll do this in my, when I'm doing my own planning. But I'll do this in just like my annual, because I'm a nerd, and I will do it in my annual planning. But doing this alone in isolation, it's fine. You'll always do better if you have other people, but you can only grow so much doing if only development is doing this. This is where you'll get stuck in growth and not scale. But at least you will, could grow, and you could potentially scale your fundraising while your organization maybe just stays in a growth mindset, but then you're out of balance. So not recommended. I would really work on socializing and getting folks to join my way of thinking instead. And that's where we get to like the implementation, like how do we, put this type of stuff into practice, and, the lean on the things that like we already have to do. I'm a big fan of like not recreating wheels and having multiple systems. So many of our funders are like, in your application, please fill out a SMART goal sheet for us for your project. If you're already using a particular system because it's been foisted on you either by your funders or organizationally, use a system that works for you. If you don't have a system, SMART is just easy enough. But make sure that you have a framework to that keeps you, I sort of think of it as like guardrails on a highway. Like they don't prevent me from getting to where I'm going. So they're not like, I don't think of them as bad things, but they certainly help me stay on the road. So specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, time bound. Um, Achievable and realistic, sometimes I conflate the two. I don't necessarily need two columns, but it's whatever works for you. But it shouldn't just be an exercise that you do and you just never look at again. Really, really getting to scale, growing your organization in a stepwise and methodical way means that the documents that you create in this way should be living documents and should be front of mind. The resource allocation one is really important. Again, I talked about it already, but like if you're looking at this like organizationally, you're looking at this trajectory, that you know you're going to need, this organization is going to make a big programmatic launch or expansion in a certain amount of time, that you need to make sure you're allocating resources to invest to be able to keep that program going now, even if it doesn't start for a couple of years, or especially if it doesn't start for a couple of years, because we know as fundraisers, investing in a new revenue stream, whether it's a new fundraising process or a independent revenue stream, like fee for service or, but all the different ways that you can do revenue, it's not going to be profitable in year one. If you are, awesome. That's a lottery. That's a lottery ticket. But you can't expect that to happen. It usually takes, year one is when you're fumbling around and trying to get it right. Year two is when you start to get it right and you start to see the revenue. You may turn profitable in year two, but we're talking in terms of dollars, not huge amounts of money. It's usually year three when you really start to see the growth of that plan, of that new way of fundraising or that new revenue stream, getting you into positive territory, really significant positive territory. But then, from a growth trajectory, you might only be growing that funding stream by eventually like 5% a year, but maybe in the beginning 20% and then 15% and then 10%. The growth of these are going to be small. So you're not going to be able to sustain that new program doing the exact same things you've always been doing. So you've got to build up systems. It might mean, if you're building a whole new fundraising stream, it might mean doing that and investing some, if you are grants heavy, in a grant writer to help you put more grant proposals out there. So you create a little bit more of a grant safety net to give you the room that you need while this other fundraising aspect, this other fundraising method gains strength. It's a way to sort of using something that you're good at, leaning on something that you're really good at to give you the space that you need to try something different. Now, you might get some pushback. I'm like, well, if you're just going to invest in a grant writer, why do you need to invest in this other thing? Because we know grants funders are fickle, like you've all talked about already, and that can change. So this is about creating cushion today while we build something new, so that we can be ready, so that we can meet the needs of our future plan. And then we, like, this always is going to go back to our numbers and data, our KPIs. So like I said, metrics is an important thing. Measuring along the way, creating things that you can measure. So one of the things that I see a lot of organizations do is, like, we have these really great CRMs that'll tell us like open rates and click rates and, all of the stuff, if we're doing individual, let's say small donor fundraising. But I can't get folks to answer the question of like, so how's the program doing? What messaging works? How are you using the data of those individual emails to tell you a story? Like I've done analysis where I compared our engagement, an organization's engagement emails and their fundraising emails, and they have like wildly different rates of interaction. Now, we know the fundraising emails don't do as well across the board, like national data, as advocacy emails or other types of emails. but are they so out of whack that they're like, wait, they don't even look like what the national numbers say, what those benchmarks look like? Um, why? What's going on? Who's writing those engagement pieces and who's writing those fundraising pieces? And why don't they sound the same? Or why don't they sound like they're from the same organization if they don't sound alike? Why are they behaving? Why are they being opened so differently or interacted with so differently? Now, open rates are sort of a bogus number now. So if your organization is tracking open rates, you're not tracking the right thing anymore. Things have changed in the tech world over the last couple of years, but those CRMs are still leaning on that because they haven't, I guess, advanced. I'm not entirely sure why they lean on it, but you might have data collection systems that you're really just not doing anything with. You're not using it effectively. But so make sure that like you're not, that your metrics, that your systems of data and your systems, like all of the spreadsheets that you can create are being used to it for improvement purposes. Like I can't tell you how often I hear of like I don't want to ask more because I don't want to have more unsubscribes. Why are you afraid of unsubscribes? Who's unsubscribing? Have you ever looked at the people who are unsubscribing? Typically, like, if I had a whole bunch of unsubscribes to an email solicitation of a whole bunch of people who haven't clicked through an email, an advocacy email or a newsletter in a year, bye. This is really about like thinking strategically. So don't be afraid of potential losses of data, for example. Because that's like focusing on pennies instead of, dollars. Melanie, go ahead.
I was just wondering, in your opinion, what are some of the most helpful or most, sort of indicative indicators that you would look for?
Specifically in like an email campaign, email or
Yeah, just an email campaign would be fine, but just in terms of like what sorts of things, because I'm sort of in that role right now of trying to figure out with how I'm integrating my program into the actual programmatic work of the organization. And I am a big like believer in numbers and data, but that's not something that happens throughout the rest of the organization at the same time. So, I can collect the data on what I'm doing, but I'm not sure how that sort of plays into the rest of the work.
Okay, thanks for the context. So I think that one of the traps that we fall into is like there are people in our organization that are going to get really excited about list growth and not necessarily engagement. Like, is the yay, we added 5,000 people to our list this year. What are they doing? Like, are they clicking? Are they responding? Are they signing up? Are they signing petitions? So I look at what happens to someone once they join the list, how active, if I can track the activity, like the number of people who joined the list in 2022, how many of them are opening emails, clicking lists, signing petitions, going to events, what proportion of them are actually doing things. So I tend to look at things of like, if I'm going to segment, I'd have my inactive, like they're on the list, but they haven't done anything, not opened an email, not signed a petition, not done anything. I'll have my non-donors not done anything. Then I'd have my non-donors active, and I'd define what active is. Maybe active means that they've opened an email, not just like clicked an email in the last 18 months or 12 months. So I create a definition. What does it mean? Maybe it means that I want them to do more than click. I want them to sign a petition. So active equals, and I create a definition around it. So that's another segment. Then I'd go into the donor segment. This like donors who I tend to put my current donor pile as people who gave last calendar year, and this calendar year. if they've given any time in that 24-month period. Some folks will just do 12 months, some folks will do 18. I try to do it by calendar year just because a lot of donors think in annuals, and it's really easy to forget an annual gift. So that's how I build in a little grace. And I put my lapsed donors in anybody who gave before last year. So I would actually then look at my data in those segments. We already know what the non-donor, not active people are doing because they're doing nothing. Then I would look at my non-donor active and try to figure out what I can figure out. What, like we've defined active now, how much do people engage with our content? And take a look at how this group of people engage with our content. You can say like there's 2,000 people, and on average, these 2,000 people open 3 emails a year, and they do one other action. Then you can look at your lapsed donors and see how they behave compared to the non-donor active or the nothing people. And then you can look at your current list and see how they behave. Now, those are just like 4 easy segments to look at, but then seeing how those different groups of people are responding and behaving could then possibly tell you a story of like how to shape what content goes to those folks. And also, this is one of those places where savings and efficiency can come into play, where a lot of our CRMs are pay by the pound is the way that I refer to it. It's like every time you add another, 5,000 people to your database, you get the congratulations. You now have this new price point that you have to pay monthly. You're growing your list and you're paying us more money. So I would probably create like a protocol for what happens with those folks who haven't done anything to move them off the list. And then I would try to create benchmarks or at least goals to up engagement. If my engagement's not doing great, when I look at these different groups of people, then I would try to like talk to folks who work in those areas and see like, how do we do better at engagement? Because we know that a more engaged person becomes a donor, and a donor who's also engaged is going to be your champion. He's going to sign your petitions, is going to show up to your events, is going to write their representative, is going to do all the things. So I tend to like to create benchmarks that are not just in fundraising, but are about the people and how the people behave in those areas. So if not open rates, but click rates, sign up rates by segment. Did that make any sense at all?
Yeah, that was great. Thank you so much.
Did any other folks have questions or comments, or did I miss something that you thought would be covered today? I love that people think I'm perfect. Just kidding. As usual, y'all, I really appreciate your time and attention. I always love it when we have good conversations and participation. So I thank you all for your participation in the conversation today. And you can see us on our next fundraising Friday coming up, not in September, but actually in November. And we we'll see you then. Keep a lookout for the fundraising Friday emails from Michelle Mengel. Sign up for one-on-one coaching if you want any. And look forward to the next time. Bye, y'all.